Greetings everyone, I'm Mar. Once again, this is my opinion, as you can tell from the title up there, continuing my reviews of the Mummy series. It is now, of course, the final film in the original 4 films starring Kharis, or should I say to feature Kharis. And of course is The Mummy's Curse. And if you thought the last entry I reviewed showed that they were starting to run out of steam, this is where all the steam is gone and they're just running on fumes and coals. Hope and a prayer. They're halfway there. But before I get too far into my actual thoughts on the film, just a reminder, if you want to support the channel, both the Patreon and PayPal links are down below. If you want to continuously support the channel and gain access to other videos early, go the Patreon route. If you would like to just do a one-off request or support, go the PayPal. Either way, your support is appreciated. The Mummy's Curse. Released 2 years after the previous film, it takes place 25 years after the previous film. Now, I'm going to explain why that is a little important and a little interesting, more so in retrospect. The Mummy's Hand takes place in contemporary times for when the film was made, which was 1940. So it takes place in the early 40s. The Mummy's Tomb and the Mummy's Ghost both take place 30 years after the original, so 1970. Yet it does not feel like the 70s at all, but it's one of those things you try to make it more contemporary, semi-contemporary, make it have a little timeless feeling for your audience, and not try to guess the future. So I'm gonna say it's a little bit better that they don't try to guess the future, because then you don't like, oh, that's wrong. But to that end, The Mummy's Curse taking place 25 years after that means that this film takes place in 1995. I was 6 years old in 1995. That's the reason I find it amusing. This is the decade of Pogs, AOL discs, Will Smith rap music, amongst other big pop culture things. So it's like, really? This is when the Mummy decided to come around? It's just one of those weird little things. Anyway, it's directed by Leslie Goodwins, who he has directed a handful of other stuff, but nothing really popped up. So unlike his predecessors, definitely did not have as much of a prolific career, but he still did get work. Which, of course, is showing my thing, is that as these films go along, and it becomes more about making a profit and making money for the studio, and less care with the story and all that, just popping them out, which kind of can sum up the ending of the second horror cycle for Universal. They have to get less prolific directors. Of course, they still got Lon Chaney Jr. in there. For him, they're gonna spare no expense. And they tried to make him playing the Mummy a little easier this time, because instead of just fully having him do full makeup like the previous 2 entries, he's actually wearing a mask that Jack Pierce created. And it's the only part of his legacy, other than the films, that has been preserved, because the mask has been preserved by Bob Burns, and it's the only thing from Pierce's makeup collection that is known to still exist. There might be other pieces, they just haven't been authenticated yet. This is the only one for sure. You can definitely tell it has its age. And it's at permanent display at the Experience Music Project Museum in Seattle, Washington, as part of its horror movie exhibit, which is one thing I'd like to see if I ever do go up there. Now, the mask, since I brought it up, I'm going to say, when you're watching the film, you can definitely tell it's a mask at times. So it does kind of hurt the illusion a little bit. The black and white that the film was shot in helps a bit, but you can notice it. And it didn't help that I watched Ghost and Curse literally back to back. So if you're watching these films in sequence, you'll definitely notice it. Just like how from Hand to Tomb, you'll notice the difference in the fact that there's no effect over the eyes and it's a different actor. Then from Ghost to Curse, you notice that with the mask. It just is what it is, I guess. Other people in the cast, we got Peter Coyle as Zandab, if I'm pronouncing his name right, which is the new priest. Then we got Dennis Moore as Dr. James Halsey. Virginia Christine playing Ananka, who after this she would go on to fame as the Folgers Coffee Lady, excuse me. And then Kurt Katch as Cajun Joe. There's more people in the cast, but no people jumped up out at me. Now, the film takes place, like I said, 25 years after the previous one. And right away, you can definitely tell that there's loose continuity here, which, keep that in mind, because it's going to explain something else that's going to happen in a bit. Now, loose continuity is that the film continues off with the fact that the mummy and Ananka sank into a swamp. However, with this film, it changes the location. In the previous films, it's taking place up in New England, so a New England swamp. Here, our action has been moved to the Louisiana bayou. So now we're in Cajun country. So with that, you can imagine we get some southern stereotyped characters there, which adds a little bit to the fun of the film because we see them going around and reacting to it, which leads to this film's catchphrase, "The devil's on the loose and he's dancing with the mummy." It's a nice little catchphrase we hear a couple times. And seeing those characters, like Cajun Joe's a nice little background character. 25-year pass. It's just one of those things that it kind of creates a little bit of continuity thing. But when you're watching a lot of the Universal horror films from the second cycle, there is loose continuity from film to film, even when the film is made as a sequel like this one is. There's even some loose continuity with some of the Frankenstein films later on. So it's one of those things, like I said last time, you know what you're getting when you go and watch these films. So don't try to scratch your head too much on it and like trying to connect it to, like you're trying to do a math problem up on the board. But at least they do try to continue on from the fact that they're in the swamp. There is a project going on that the government is doing where they're trying to make life better for the citizens of this town. Part of it involves the lake being worked on, so definitely seems like something that would happen in the 90s with this part of the swamp. Now, everyone is still a little superstitious, like carrying over from the previous film about the mummies going in there. I mean, that's where we get that 25-year pass line, because they're trying to, like, talk it over, be like, yeah, there's no way the mummy is still out there. But, of course, Kharis does surface, once again guarded by the priest from his temple. Since it's 25 years later, obviously we don't get George Zuko, because if he was old in the previous two films, he'd probably be particularly ancient here, so them not showing him. Logical step. This is where we get the other little bit of film, which is, by modern standards, would be a bit lazy unless it's like a recap at the beginning, very quick. But back then it was a bit more normal because of the fact that back in the 40s, when it was just film and television really hadn't started yet, or was in its extreme infancy, and you didn't watch films, you didn't have home video, obviously. So the only time you saw films was in the theaters and during re-releases, unless you happened to be someone who could afford to rent those lower quality reels. I make that point to get to this point. That back then, audiences didn't really have the chance to rewatch the films over and over like we did now. Like, back then when these films were coming out, being able to hold up all the films like this, obviously you're like a bigger thing with all the reels, was a select privilege unless you had connections or, like I said, rented. So using film time to recap what happened before, while it seems lazy from a modern perspective, back then it was the norm. Now, it still does eat up a decent amount of time, and it's like, really? The last film didn't have a recap this in-depth, so why are we doing this one? So, it's the norm, but you can still look at it as a cheat to eat up some of the runtime, because a lot of these films are just about an hour. Like, these last two ones were at the hour marker, a little bit longer. So if you were to take out this recap, it definitely is below it. And then when you add in the fact there's a lot of scenes that just running where not a lot is happening, and there's a lot of lull moments, even more so than the previous ones, then it's like, ew. Which is probably this film's biggest sin, and why I say at the beginning of the review that it's running on fumes here. There's only a handful of good things about this film I could go with. One, of course, is the Cajun setting. Nice little change of pace. Just wish we had a better overall story with it. The makeup and all that, even though it's cheaper this time, still looks good. Lon Chaney. I mean, the cinematography is taking a step down, but since we got the Cajun setting, it does show it off pretty decently. I mean, the background acting of the characters, what you expect from this time period and this type of characters, which is why it makes it entertaining. And then, of course, the ending a little bit, although there are some qualms with it. There's just only a handful of things to praise in this one, because, like I said, they're fully out of steam here. Now, Ananka does rise from it, and she is found... I don't get back on the plot. She's found by a couple of people who live in this town. They take her in, And of course, with Kharis being back and once again being charged to find Ananka by the priest, he goes and, like the last film, kills anyone that gets in his way, chases her, eventually takes her back to the hideout they're at. The heroes come in, and like you would expect in these films in the second wave of the horror cycle, evil's defeated and everything's all wrapped up nice and neat. And once again, Kharis turns on his handlers. Now, I like this one. The previous one is a little bit more cathartic, considering we've seen this priest's meltdown in front of our eyes and be like, oh no, when Kharis finds out, he's not going to be happy. And then the way Chaney played it when he went to grab him. Here it's a little bit more physical because the secondary priest has locked himself in looks to be a jail cell area, and Kharis is trying to get in. Even though at one point when he knocks part of it down, I was watching, I'm like, Kharis, you know you could just reach in and push the door unlock. You don't have to keep flipping your crap. But I guess as an undead mummy, he doesn't really have all of his brains still there. So he has to knock the door off, and I'm thinking, is this guy going to try to do some Rey Mysterio crap to escape from the mummy? But nope. The mummy goes in, comes in, and then he's crushed to death with falling stuff. Now, that's a decent way to die, but it's like with everything we've seen Kharis go through in this film series, that's what finally does him in. I mean, think about it. He was burnt already. In the last film, he sank into a swamp, and here, it's all that, the falling debris that finally gets him. Now, it's a bit more than the way I had heard it through word of mouth and other reviews, specifically James Rolfe's review, but watching it, it's like, okay, it's a little down, but it's still a decent way. It's just that probably should not have been the last way we saw him go and die. And of course, Ananka once again sinks into the swamp, and she's gone. No, actually, she doesn't sink into the swamp. She just turns back into a mummy. Which, it's sad, considering that in the previous film we saw she was a reincarnation, and should have been able to live her own life, but I guess with everything with Kharis interfering with it and the whole mummy magic thing, they never really fully explain it. I guess she's gone and going back into the crypt. Which is sad, but since it's 25 years after the previous film, it's like, at this point, who is she going to go back to? All of the friends and family she have are probably going to be gone or old. But it is what it is. I mean, it's there. It just doesn't have the same impact as the previous one where we're like, oh, she's actually going to die. Here, after Kharis is defeated, Ananka goes down and the priests are dead. It is kind of a happy ending for the minor characters, like a romance between the character that was coming to study the mummies and the secretary, who is the niece of the guy running the show when it comes to this project they're on. Nice beginning of a relationship there, or a potential relationship, and him making a little gag, like, yeah, to take her, she hasn't been much use as a secretary since she arrived. And then a little parting romantic moment. It is what you would expect from that, so it's one of those things where, you know, we got to end it on a happy note, especially since it's going to be the last one, and this film doesn't even have as much steam. So it strikes me as this movie's version of, if you can excuse the wrestlingism, Hogan Must Pose. And it's an okay way to end the film, but I'm just looking at it and go, really, that's how they end the film, and that's how you end the Mummy series? On a film with not a lot of steam, not a lot of reason to justify itself, and I mean, as I've said at the top of this of reviewing these films, this kind of is like the first slasher series, even if not every single trope is there, enough are. And this is another trope we come up to, diminishing returns on the sequels, even with creative bankruptcy. The only difference is with a lot of the later entries, even if they're not the best one, they usually are a lot more entertaining. Like, I'm going to be straight up. Taking aside my nostalgia and love for classic Universal horror, and the fact that Lon Chaney Jr. is in this film, the so-so sequels in the Nightmare on Elm Street, Friday the 13th, and Halloween series, I would rather sit through just, randomly than this film. This is definitely one of those sequels I only see myself rewatching if I'm showing it to somebody for the first time, or I'm watching the entire series in a straight marathon. Independently, I don't really see myself doing it. Maybe if I'm paid for it as part of a Patreon thing, like if someone wants me to do a rambling commentary for it or something like that, maybe. But other than watching it with someone or marathon, I don't see myself watching it again. But it's interesting to see another one of those horror movie tropes clicked off. And for a while, this was the end of the Mummy series, but a decade later, when they were doing all the Abbott and Costello Meet films, they did this one. I'm just going to say the only one of those films I've seen so far is Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. I haven't seen The Invisible Man, I haven't seen Meet the Mummy, so one of these times I'll probably do a review of all of them, the Abbott and Costello Meet ones. I know one that I also want to see is Meet the Killer Boris Karloff, because it's freaking Boris Karloff. Now, even that was not the end of the Mummy series, because in the end of the 50s, Hammer, when they were remaking all the classic ones, they struck a deal with Universal, and they got the rights to remake The Mummy. And what they did was they took the best elements from all 5 of these films, put it in a blender, and made a very excellent film. Now, what they took from the original Karloff film is more or less its tone and a little bit of its pacing, but they took the rest of the story elements from the Kharis films. His backstory, his name, Ananka, him getting punished by being the living mummy. Now, they did kind of make the storyline there a little bit straighter. Nothing about him being buried alive and then dug up and then buried next to Ananka like this film presents. And, of course, him wanting to kill all the people that desecrated the tomb of Ananka, and even down to the love interest of our hero being the reincarnation of Ananka, and a lot of the other scenes. And it does it a lot better than the Frankenstein film that Hammer would made right after that. And it's a prime example of how you do a remake where you take the best elements of the previous films and put it in a blender and use it. The next best example after that would be the Friday the 13th reboot that they did in 2009, where it took the best elements from 2, 3, and 4, put it in a blender, and made an excellent original film out of it. It's a shame it's a little bit hard to do. You guys all know my thoughts on Revenge of Frankenstein when it comes to them doing that. And you're going to get more of my in-depth thoughts on the Hammer Mummy film, and possibly its sequel in a little bit. And of course, in the late 90s, they remade the Mummy film again, taking the tone from this one, some other notes from the original one, but more or less an original plot. Of course, that's a film that's a classic on its own. It looks to me like I got all the horses. And of course, it had its own sequels and its own spin-off in the form of the Scorpion King. And then a couple years ago, when Universal was trying to redo the Monster Universe The Dark Universe, and they tried to do it with their new Mummy film with Tom Cruise, it was a failure from what I hear. I haven't seen it. The only scene I've seen is the Mr. Hyde scene, which seems like a good scene in the middle of the film, but I hear it's probably one of the best parts of the film, and the film isn't really that good, but we'll see when I eventually decide to watch it. Maybe when I review the Brendan Fraser ones, I'll do that as the addendum at the very, very end. Now, I mentioned a thing about Chaney and the mask. Now, there's a couple other bits of trivia that were of note, like the famous sequence where Ananka rises from the dead is slightly under crank, and it speeds up the action, but it gives it an eerie, unreal quality, which makes sense considering she's a living mummy. If you look closely at the background with the plants, it kind of gives it away, but there's a lot of other scenes where that happens, like the knife trick scene in Aliens. If you look closely at Al Capone, you'll notice that it gives the trick away. Now, like I mentioned, Chaney's drinking on the set in the previous film. It was no better on this one. Virginia Christine, who played Ananka, mentioned that when Chaney carried her away, she was attached to him with a harness that went around his neck and waist. Partially, I'm assuming due to safety reasons because of her weight. And I'm saying that because you're carrying another human, even though back then they'd probably be like, just carry her. I mean, and even if it was a him, it would just carry him. I mean, there's a reason Boris Karloff strained himself on the set of the first Frankenstein film. But here, more safety reasons, because Chaney was drunk throughout most of the picture. Like the scenes where he carries her up the steep, crooked, worn steps, she said he's absolutely stoned and weaving, going side to side on those uneven steps. Which fits the character because he's supposed to be an ancient mummy that's gone through a lot of crap, so his body's not in the best condition. So from the in-universe thing for the film makes sense, but when you look at it for the real reason, it's like, ooh. And you can't help but feel sorry for Chaney that he had such a bad time and at a low point in his life that he had to stay drunk even while on set. Nowadays, that would not be allowed to happen, but back then, they try to swing those things under the rug. Now, Christine was concerned because they were attached, and with Chaney being inebriated, and that if he fell, what would happen to her? Thankfully, this part is one of the few times where Chaney was replaced with a double. Which is why I'm thinking that for the previous film, eventually the story came out that he was replaced for a double there. And then the director had to come in and go, no. So I'm guessing with that film, it looks like he had his drinking under control a bit more, or it was a bit easier for that director to get him under control with it. But since this film, a little bit of a step down production and quality-wise, I could see why at first they'd be like, okay, try to work with him, and then eventually go screw it, because Chaney didn't get it under control. Now, that's one thing I'll have to look into one of these days. Maybe one of these days I'll start doing a video series on these classic horror icons. That'd probably be a video essay one where I go through their career and all that, talk about their highs and lows. I probably should do it at least for the big three of this era: Karloff, Lugosi, and Chaney Jr. That'd be interesting. Maybe throw in Claude Rains in there, because you gotta love Claude Rains. That's really all that's left to say about the film. Nothing else to put there. Probably should have mentioned that trivia earlier, but as you can kind of guess, it's not going to get the Mars stamp of approval as a whole. It's only if you're going to take this film series and marathon watch it, or you're just curious. And that's all I got to say about it. So until next time, guys, don't desecrate any tombs.